My talk tonight is going to be about political liberalism in Anthony Trollope's Palliser novels, specifically the extent to which Trollope's own liberalism — he was the Liberal candidate for Beverley in the East Riding of Yorkshire during the 1868 election — is evident in the series. To give an overview of his work, Trollope was a prolific author of the mid-Victorian era. He published 47 novels, a dozen or so short stories, 2 plays, and several works of non-fiction. Critically acclaimed for much of his career, his stock waned in later life, but found a renaissance in the 20th century. Indeed, Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister from 1957 to 63, heir to his family's Macmillan publishing house, an avid literature fan, once famously quipped that his favourite thing in life was being able to slip off to bed early with a Trollope. Of his novels, he is best known for 14. The 6 chronicles of Barsetshire novels that detail the lives of the gentry and clergy in the fictional county of Barsetshire and its cathedral town of Barchester. Works of social realism without whose precedent Marian Evans later conceded she could not have written Middlemarch, which, given that it is my favourite English literature novel, I am particularly grateful for. And the 6 Palliser novels, which chronicle the lives and loves of the ruling Whig liberal aristocracy through a grand ensemble of characters centred around Plantagenet Palliser, heir to the Duchy of Omnium, the wealthiest title in Europe as the name suggests, and his wife Lady Glencora. The other 2 most noted of his works are The Way We Live Now, which is often considered his masterpiece and of which I own a copy but have never got around to reading, and The American Senator. It is important to note that Palliser is a 20th century way of referring to these novels. Planty Pal, as he is known to his friends, was actually first introduced in the Barsetshire novel The Small House at Allington as a potential suitor of Lady Dumbello prior to his arranged marriage to Lady Glencora. His uncle, George Palliser, Duke of Omnium, is introduced in Dr. Thorne. In this way, the Pallisers are not unique to the Palliser series, nor are they always the central characters. In the Eustace Diamonds, they play at best a peripheral role, whilst Can You Forgive Her deals not so much with politics as with Planty and Glen's arranged marriage, and the love triangle between them and Glencora's erstwhile paramour, Burgo Fitzgerald, and again only as a parallel subplot, with Glencora's cousin Alice Vavasor being the more central character in the novel. Trollope himself spoke of the parliamentary novels, Phineas Finn, Phineas Redux, The Prime Minister, and The Duke's Children, as they are the most explicitly political. As the focus of the talk is to be on politics, I am going to focus primarily on the second novel in the series, Phineas Finn, it being the most political novel in the series, and the one which deals most extensively with Trollope's views on the political events of his day, but with some reference to the other novels where it illustrates or develops the point well. I will look primarily at 3 themes in the novel: electoral reform, Irish tenant rights, and gender relations, arguing that at each turn Trollope's characterisation and discourse are influenced by his self-proclaimed belief in conservative liberalism, a worldview Lynette Felber claims places Trollope in line with the Victorian liberals Goodlid describes as dominated by a contradictory concept of the social bond, characterised by a view of the human telos that implied the limitless improvability of human beings, but also depending on intrinsically unequal relations between hierarchised groups. This I will do without hopefully any major spoilers. First published as a monthly serial in St Paul's Magazine between October 1867 and May 1868, Phineas Finn tells the story of the son of a doctor from the village of Killaloe, County Clare in Ireland, the eponymous Phineas, who is elected to Parliament as a Liberal, and how this middle-class Catholic Irishman tries to find his way in the aristocratic Protestant world of Whig politics in Westminster and the stately homes of England and Scotland. It deals with his friendships and romantic life, particularly the potential romances that develop between him and Lady Laura Standish, Miss Violet Effingham, Madame Marie Max Goesler, and his Irish country sweetheart, Mary Flood Jones. It also deals with his attempts to secure ministerial office. Before the Parliament Act of 1911, MPs were not paid salaries, and so one could only serve in Parliament if they had some outside source of income or if they joined the ministry, and we can talk a little bit more about the politics of the time after the talk. Much of the tension in the novel concerns the conflict between Finn's desire to be a man of political principle, his genuine pragmatic realism, his loyalty to his friends, and his own self-interest. This inner conflict is telling about Trollope's own conservative liberal views on the duties of public servants, something to which I will return later in the talk. In 1867, the Conservative Ministry of Lord Derby passed the Representation of the People Act, commonly known as the Second Reform Act. This redistributed parliamentary representation away from many of the rotten boroughs, areas where a handful of electors, either under the control of the local lord or bought off through bribery, decided the fate of the seat, towards the burgeoning urban centres, and doubled the suffrage to around 2 of the UK's then 7 million voting-age male population through allowing non-compounded renters and not just property owners to vote in general elections. In 1868, the compounding of rent was outlawed, meaning all male heads of household acquired the franchise. The Conservative ministry which passed the bill had come to office after the fall of the ministry of the Liberal Prime Minister Lord John Russell, paternal grandfather of philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell, and graduate, as are all the greatest political thinkers, of Edinburgh University, after their failed attempt to pass a similar reform bill the year before. Russell's reform bill had been defeated in the Commons by a combination of the Conservatives, led by Benjamin Disraeli, and 40 dissenting Liberal MPs. In the world of Phineas Finn, the Liberal Prime Minister Mildmay is attempting to steer a reform bill through Parliament, but is facing opposition from the machinations of the Conservative opposition leader Mr Daubeny and a rebellious faction of radical backbench Liberal MPs, led by the charismatic demagogue Mr Turnbull, who oppose their own government's bill on the grounds that it does not include a mandatory secret ballot. That many of the politicians in the series are analogous to leading politicians of the day is indeed fairly obvious. Mildmay is described as an old man nearing retirement, and Russell had previously been Prime Minister between 1846 and 52, first taken office fully 20 years before the events described in the novel, who had become estranged and reconciled to the previous Liberal leader, Mr Brock. Russell too had been estranged from his predecessor, Lord Palmerston, the dominant Liberal statesman of the middle third of the 19th century, and, as are all the great political thinkers, a graduate of Edinburgh University, over the Don Pacifico affair, when Palmerston was Foreign Secretary in Russell's first government. Mildmay's successor is Mr Gresham, described as the finest orator in Europe, the man destined to succeed Mildmay, who wished to fashion the world anew from the sheer power of his intellect, and an adherent of the disestablishment of the Irish Church, all of which clearly marks him out as Gladstone. So obvious is Trollope's use of characters analogous to contemporary political figures that the March 31st, 1869 edition of The Telegraph, printed in response to the publication of the first non-serialised edition, that it was neither gentlemanly nor right to malign public men for the supposedly private characters, a charge Trollope disingenuously denied. This accusation was levelled about 2 characters in particular, the treacherous Tory leader Daubeny and the radical demagogue Turnbull, who collude across the aisle to bring down Mildmay's bill in his ministry. Daubeny is clearly analogous to Benjamin Disraeli. Beyond that his nickname Dubby is an obvious play on Disraeli's nickname Dizzy, he is portrayed as a scheming opportunist, determined to force the government out and advance his own ambitions by any means necessary. And this is very much in keeping with the popular perception of Disraeli. The man who coined the term climbing the greasy pole to describe a political career was described by his contemporary, Lord Robert Cecil, who later served 3 terms as Tory Prime Minister as the 3rd Marquess of Salisbury, as shameless, although it should be noted that Salisbury, of whom there is a bust in the debating chamber at the Oxford Union, was an anti-Semite who regarded Disraeli as an upstart, an adventurer and a Jew, and by his biographer Robert Blake as perhaps the first statesman systematically to uphold the doctrine that it is the duty of the opposition to oppose. Indeed, he might be said by this practice to have established the precedent on which all subsequent opposition leaders have acted. Whatever proposal the government put forward, whatever its merits, you could always find something wrong with it, some reason for attack. In the end, if you went on long enough, you would beat them in the House, or at the very least put yourself in position to beat them at the next general election. Disraeli's first instinct was to oppose, and if he did not always do so, it was for reasons of expediency or because Derby overruled him. To Disraeli, the object of politics was power, and he never forgot it. More telling, though, is Trollope's characterisation of Turnbull, analogous to the radical Liberal MP John Bright. Bright had introduced a bill to establish universal suffrage, which was not supported by the Russell Ministry. Indeed, they entered their own ill-fated bill, which Bright and Disraeli combined to oppose. Bright was one of the finest parliamentary orators of his time, held a number of ministerial appointments in the governments of Gladstone, and was a hero to the 20th century Liberal Prime Ministers Asquith and Lloyd George. In Phineas Finn, Turnbull is presented as a rabble-rousing demagogue, a man who encourages mob violence. He's seen encouraging the riot and mob outside Parliament as a political tactic to pressure the government into accepting the secret ballot, and this alludes to a 1966 riot in Hyde Park, which was actually a response to a meeting of the Reform League being declared illegal and broken up by the police, and was not an organised political tactic. Turnbull is also depicted as being in league with Quintus Slide, the editor of radical newspaper The People's Banner. Throughout the series, Slide and his publication are depicted as unscrupulous gutter press hacks determined to bring down decent liberal reformers through lies, libel, and blackmail. Trollope denied that Turnbull was analogous to Bright, but this is disingenuous to put it mildly. The similarities are multiple. Turnbull is, like Bright, a wealthy manufacturer with a great many servants. He is a Quaker, a free trade activist, socially overbearing and private, a formidable debater, a temperance advocate, and he even sports Bright's trademark ubiquitous black silk waistcoat. Trollope's contempt for Bright was to persist for years. In 1882, he penned a fantasy called The Fixed Period, in which a ship called HMS John Bright has a gun so powerful it need never be used, and whilst devastating the body, it has no power over the mind, a clear reference to Trollope's opinion of the man as a demagogue. This demonstrates to us the essence of Trollope's conservative liberalism. He advocated electoral reform, an ending of rotten boroughs, and the expansion of the franchise to the quote-unquote respectable working class. However, not universal suffrage and not the secret ballot, which he saw as a recipe for corruption. Both Tories and radicals who opposed a sensible reform bill are demonised. However, curiously absent from Trollope's ire in the novel, and any mention in the secondary literature I've ever looked at, is the Adulamites, a faction of conservative liberals who opposed Russell's bill as they were against further electoral reform of any kind. They made up roughly half of the liberal rebels against Russell, and yet they escaped censure of any kind in the events of Phineas Finn. Ironically, the term Abdullamites was coined by John Bright in reference to the biblical tale of the future King David seeking refuge from Saul in the cave of Adullam in the first book of Samuel. Characters being analogous to contemporary politicians and their characterizations reflecting Trollope's political prejudices, those analogous to his heroes being portrayed as towering statesmen, while those of opposing parties are schemers, the demonization of radicals for opposing the Liberal government, but no mention of the conservative Liberals who did the same, is one dimension of how Trollope's political leanings, his reactionary liberalism, is evident in the book. However, a more nuanced and complex picture of Trollope's views come out when considering the actual character Phineas Finn's stances on the great issues of the day. The political scientist Peter Mailander writes that the influence of Cicero on Trollope's political ideals is criminally overlooked in the secondary literature on his thought and novels. Trollope produced a 2-volume biography of the Roman statesman, The Life of Cicero, in 1880. Cicero had produced a treatise on morality, De Officiis, around 44 BC, in which he considers the question from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics of whether it is better to live the contemplative life of the philosopher or the practical life of the politician or military general. Aristotle sides with the former, as he sees the exercise of rationality as the ultimate moral virtue, as it is mankind's distinguishing characteristic in his ladder of nature taxonomy. Man is the rational animal, and thus the life of intellectual integrity is an end in itself, as opposed to the practical, political, or martial life, which detracts one from the pursuit of pure reason and is a means to an end like glory or prestige. Cicero took the other view. Whilst writing with highest praise of the contemplative life of uncompromised intellectual freedom and integrity, he believed that without some justifiable disqualifying reasons, individuals who profess a scorn for civil and military offices, which most people admire, I think that this should be set down not to their credit, but to their discredit. for they seem to dread the toil and trouble, and also perhaps the discredit and humiliation of political failure and defeat. But those whom nature has endowed with the capacity for administering public affairs should put aside all hesitation, enter the race for public office, and take a hand in directing the government. For in no other way can a government be administered or greatness of spirit be made manifest. Indeed, de officiis translates roughly as duties or obligations. People with the ability to do so have a duty to serve the polity, because only government by the good can produce good government. Melander highlights the influence of Cicero on Trollope by drawing attention to a passage in Can You Forgive Her, where Palliser is trying to convince a character called John Grey to run for Parliament. And this is actually my favourite passage in the book, which I think is the most pedestrian of the entire Palliser series. The scholarly Grey says that he has no interest in Parliament, but in books, and that he wishes that he may be an aid in living honestly and dying fearlessly. Trollope, as narrator, tells us that Palliser knows that his life is spent serving others, allowing them to live honestly and die fearlessly. However, the reticent Palliser merely tells Grey he thinks that a man can live both honestly and sit in Parliament. This conflict is evident in Finn's dilemma over parliamentary reform. A Democrat and reforming Liberal by nature, Finn supports reform morally and intellectually. However, he has entered Parliament through a rotten borough in the hands of the Tory Lord Tulla, who agrees not to oppose him as Finn's father is Tulla's physician. Subsequently, Tulla supports a Tory against Finn, who changes seats to Loughton, a pocket borough in the interests of Lord Brentford, the father of his potential love interest Lady Laura Standish, and more on her later, and father of his friend Oswald, Lord Chiltern. Finn is faced with the choice between living honestly or sitting in Parliament, and I won't potentially spoil the book for anyone by saying which way he goes in the end. This tension between justice and expediency, between being Aristotle's good man or Cicero's good citizen, is given a further layer. Melander makes the argument that modern politics adds an additional dimension to this classic problem, political parties, of which he argues Trollope has a decidedly Burkean opinion, seeing them as necessary conditions for the advancement of society, as a world where each man is subject only to the whims of conscience would produce a different position for every individual, with nothing ever being achieved. The compromise inherent in requiring a collective party-based politics is in this view the best way to ensure that change happens, yet happens at a measured and manageable pace. In this vein, the good citizen is a good partisan, someone who realises that each MP is but 1/600th of Parliament, and so combinations of men are needed, and that an MP's supreme loyalty is to his party. This is what gives rise to the complexity of Trollope's characters. They are not one-dimensional caricatures, but human beings with complex motivations. They are cliquey, but also loyal to their comrades. They have principles, but realise that this means nothing if they blunder the political game. They seek office to advance causes, but are sanguine about losing office to the opposition, knowing that office will come again when the democratic pendulum swings back. Whilst Trollope does paint many a picture of cynical hackery, notably Barrington Errol, the Liberal chief whip, a close ally of Palliser, Mildmay and Gresham, and the man who first persuades Finn to run for Parliament. When Finn tells him he is his own man and with his own ideas, Errol simply smiles and pats him on the back and says superciliously, "Of course you are." The difference between the hack and the good citizen is that the hack works backwards from party loyalty, whilst the good citizen agonises over difficult decisions where they know they have to do the utilitarian thing and compromise themselves for the broader political project. Or, as I would put it, to know what is just, but to do what one must. The tension between being a good man and a good partisan is exemplified in Finn's agony over the issue of Irish tenant rights. In a visit to Dublin, Finn's eyes are open to some landlords' abuses of their tenants, notably increases in rent to reflect improvements to properties made at the expense and labour of the tenants themselves by Joshua Monk, a leading minister and close ally and friend of the group around Finn, Palliser and Gresham. He tells two meetings that he will support any bill brought forward to end these abuses, and word of his speeches reaches London. Irish tenant rights then becomes a salient political issue, one which the ministry say they would rather see kicked down the road, as it is an inopportune time to introduce such a measure. The party machine supports him in principle, but does not want the issue raised at that moment. Finn is by this point in the narrative Minister for the Colonies, and so when a bill is introduced in the House in favour of Irish tenant rights, he is faced with resigning his ministerial office, the income it brings and potentially causing political problems for his allies, or abandoning his principles and going back on his word. He is faced with being the good man or the good partisan, and again which he decides in favour of, I will not spoil. There is more of Trollope's own thought in this plot element than merely the classic Aristotelian and Ciceronian tension, however. There are also telling shades of conservative liberalism which come to the fore when contextualised against Trollope's own biography. Trollope was raised by a barrister and a fellow of New College, Oxford, whose irascible personality and personal profligacy meant that he ended up in debt and his legal career crumbled. As such, Trollope, who was educated at Winchester and Harrow, two of England's most famous public schools, never attended university, instead got a job as a clerk in the post office, and it is from here that Trollope got the inspiration for novels like The Three Clerks, in which he satirises the civil service. And like his father, he was a difficult personality who fell into debt, and he took up the opportunity to escape his lot in 1841, aged 26, when a similar job in Banagher, Leinster opened up. He was to remain in Ireland until 1859 by a 2-year spell between 1851 and 53, and would write several novels about Irish issues. Patrick Lonergan notes that Trollope was perhaps the only Victorian novelist whose writing about Ireland were not laden with prejudice and stereotype, and Finn himself is very much a more realistic take on Victorian Ireland, especially of the middle class, than any other literary character of the period. Dark rather than red-haired, a Catholic but one of mixed parentage who expresses admiration for Anglicanism and whose disestablishmentarianism is both mild and intellectual, not sectarian, and decidedly more temperate and gentle than, say, his friend Lord Chiltern, the red-haired, violent, devil-may-care, alcohol-swilling, hyper-masculine brother of Lady Laura Standish. This spills over into the issue of Irish tenant right. As Trollope himself stated, a novelist is false who in dealing with this or that phase of life bolsters up a theory of his own with pictures that are in themselves untrue. There is at this moment a great question forward as to the tenure of land in Ireland. I may have my ideas upon it and may desire to promulgate them in a novel. But if for the sake of promoting my theory I draw a picture of Irish landlords which is not a true picture, which I have no ground for believing to be true, in which I make them out to cruel, idle, and God-abandoned reprobates because I have a theory of my own to support in my novel, then my book is a false book, and I am a liar. This perfectly encapsulates the essence of Trollope's conservative liberalism. He supported the tenant right movement as a way of protecting some unfortunate tenants against a few bad apples. Yet he was not critical of the system of land ownership or rent tenures generally. Here we can see his liberalism, a belief in using state intervention to secure fair living conditions and social progress, but this does not extend to belief in altering systems based on quote-unquote naturalistic hierarchies. Nowhere is this more evident than in perhaps the most bizarre element of Trollope's writing, gender relations. Trollope is a writer of glorious female characters, and for me his female characters are more complex and admirable than any of his male characters, besides perhaps Palliser himself. Marie Max Goesler, when introduced in Phineas Finn, is treated with suspicion, verging on complete xenophobia. She is not part of the British aristocracy, but the wealthy head of a Vienna banking dynasty, and therefore a suspected potential Jew. She is not one of us. She is especially treated with suspicion by Glencora, as Goesler is clearly the object of the Duke of Omnium, the prototypical libidinous, appetitive, idle landlord, his animal desires, and therefore a threat to her own children's inheritance of the richest dukedom in Europe. However, Goesler is portrayed as the most emotionally intelligent, gentle, wise, and selflessly loving character in the entire series. Someone who is able to win over any human being she meets purely by the evident benevolence of her character. By the end of the series, she is essentially the third person in the Palliser marriage, as she is almost an extension of Glencora herself, her closest friend and confidant, loved as one of the family, even by a man as aloof as Planty Pal. Furthermore, Goosler is an intellectually vivacious woman, a pianist, deeply read in literature, notably Shakespeare and the classics, and an avowed egalitarian. She supports universal suffrage, including for women, and for women to sit in Parliament. Furthermore, she believes in the redistribution of wealth. As she once puts it herself, she could out-Turnbull Mr. Turnbull. She also has one of my favourite lines in any Palliser novel, spoken in Phineas Finn, one which sums up the plight of women and the self-entitlement of men perfectly. It comes as she is refusing the marriage proposal of the ageing Duke of Omnium, something she's doing out of concern for his reputation and her compassion for Glencora and her young son Lord Silverbridge. She's a class act. Marie, a man at my age, does not like to be denied. To which she replies, what man likes to be denied anything by a woman at any age? A woman who denies anything is called cruel at once, even though it be her very soul. She turned round upon him. Lady Laura Standish is another example. Laura is the son of Lord Brentford, a Liberal peer who has controlled a borough for all of his adult life. She is an astute observer of the political scene and is deeply acquainted with all the leading Liberals of the day. When Finn is first elected to Parliament, she serves almost as his Sherpa through the world of Whiggish high politics, advising him on when to keep quiet and when to put forward his views, who to speak to in order to achieve certain outcomes. She gives him hints about how best to interact with the various personalities in her political set and manage their idiosyncrasies. She secures Finn a seat in Parliament in her father's borough when Lord Tula supports a rival candidate against him in his second election. She is perhaps the most nakedly politically ambitious character in the entire novel, and she has neither a vote nor a seat in Parliament. And furthermore, this is as Trollope would have wished it. For women's rights, you can say that it would be dangerous to interfere with the family arrangement, he observed to a correspondent. I think it is impossible to do so to any great extent. You cannot by act of Congress or Parliament make the woman's arm as strong as the man's, or deprive her of her position as the bearer of children. We may trouble ourselves much by debating a question which superior power has settled for us, but we cannot alter the law. The necessity of the supremacy of man is as certain to me as the eternity of the soul. For Trollope, women have a place in politics as social hostesses who help to advance the careers of their husband. The characterisation of the Palliser series as parliamentary is somewhat of a misnomer. For sure, the central characters are parliamentarians, but hardly any of the political action takes place in Parliament. Rather, politics is a game played in the gentlemen's clubs of Pall Mall, in the stately homes of the grand aristocratic families. To be advocates for their husbands and helping build social bonds with potential political allies is the proper role of women in the Trollopian worldview. This we see in the character of Lady Glencora when Plantagenet is appointed head of a coalition government of national unity tasked with sorting out a trade depression in the Prime Minister. She tries her hand at proper electioneering, trying to get a candidate, Ferdinand Lopez, elected in the seat of Silverbridge. The seat was formerly in the interest of the Duke of Omnium, and by this time Planty has succeeded to the dukedom. But since Lord de Terrier, analogous to Lord Derby's passing of the Reform Bill after the fall of Mildmay on his failed Reform Bill, the castle no longer controls the borough, and Palliser wishes it to elect an MP without his influence. When the Conservative candidate Arthur Fletcher wins the seat and Glencora's meddling becomes public knowledge, she is reminded by Palliser that he expects her to obey him in all matters pertaining to political life, as that is the role of a wife. In this respect, Trollope's views echoes Aristotle's in Book 1 of the Politics. A man is head of the household in the political sense, over his children in a royal sense of seniority and primogeniture. As Palliser himself notes, only the heads of household can be noblemen. Even heirs with courtesy titles are still commoners until they accede to the headship of the family. And over his wife in the constitutional sense, in that he is the font of authority stemming from a natural temperamental superiority. We can also see this Aristotelian bent in Palliser's reaction to how Glencora also threw herself into her role as hostess. Palliser need not win influence over his usual Liberal set, but the Conservative members of the coalition, most especially the leader of the House of Commons, Sir Orlando Drought, are a different matter entirely. Here, Glencora takes it upon herself to host lavish parties at their stately home, Matching, as a means of greasing the skids between erstwhile rivals but current colleagues. Palliser finds the whole business vulgar, ostentatious, and demeaning, whilst also acknowledging that it has practical use. In this respect, we can think of the ideal female role as the social hostess, advancing her husband's political career lying somewhere between a vice of excess and one of deficiency. In his female characters, Trollope again displays his conservative liberalism. On the one hand, he is a rare thing, a Victorian male novelist who writes fully rounded female characters. To him, women can be intelligent, wise, astute, ambitious, and have a positive role in political society. In this way, he is a progressive voice for someone of his day and age. However, one thing a woman cannot be is the equal of a man. In this, it is impossible to move beyond the supposedly a priori hierarchy. It is a fitting place to end this talk, having just alluded to the Nicomachean in ethics, as this idea not only represents Palliser's views on the proper way a wife should conduct herself in political society, but also serves as analogy for Trollope's entire political worldview as expressed in the Palliser novels. Liberal social progress must lie in the golden mean, somewhere between the vice of radical excess and Tory deficiency.